to work with the Toronto Police Service to commit them to collecting data on their police stops. And so that is considered a fairly significant step towards changing who they're stopping, because they can no longer then deny the significance of the racialized data that they're going to collect from that. And I think one piece that's probably in many of our minds, but I don't think has been explicitly said yet, is an important piece of the picture of our racism is that, like all other inequality, it's intersectional, and that we experience racism differently based on all of the other aspects of our identities that we bring to the table and to the world, and that data also needs to follow that same mapping exercise. So we need to understand data not just by which tick box do you check only one please, but actually that it needs to be more complicated than that. Because if we don't have the accurate data, it doesn't mean we can't take any steps, but it's sure hard to justify why those steps need to be taken unless we understand the picture of what's actually happening in the world.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, just further to the Commissioner's comment about data. Yeah, I agree. Right now, our ministry is responsible for doing the annual report on multiculturalism, where all provincial government ministries report into government on steps they're taking to implement and uphold the Multiculturalism Act. And yeah, it's a baby steps approach right now. There are no real targets, so we are, we're seeing small improvements. People report in on the makeup of the civil service. Does it reflect the makeup of the population? Right now, I think the makeup of the civil service is about 16% are BIPOC people, whereas across BC it's about 30%. Metro Vancouver about 50%. So we can see, and it's been slowly increasing over time. But I do think Ontario, was more ambitious, introduced new legislation, used very direct anti-racism legislation, and is setting more clear targets. And that's something that we haven't done in BC yet. And I think to really make progress on this, we need to start setting clear targets.
So I think this is a really interesting point to get us into our next question, which is a question on the gap between legislation and the practical realities on the ground of what race and racism looks like. Because we're very well aware, at the federal, provincial, even municipal levels, we have laws that are there to prevent exactly the types of issues that so many racialized individuals are confronted with. I mean, the Multiculturalism Act, signed by apparently Trudeau in the 70s, and yet still somehow we find ourselves 40, 50 years today where there are still issues. So, when one can express a gap between policy versus practicality in terms of what's happening on the ground. So my question is, how can we either apply the policies more effectively, those that already exist in our laws, in our books, or how do we go beyond legislation towards a more practical, pragmatic change in our lives? And we don't have a lot of time. I think about maybe 8 minutes, maybe we can discuss this. I actually have one more question I wanted to ask, but we are likely not going to get to it, but I will throw the last question up on there as well, maybe for our discussion at the roundtables. But perhaps we can talk about that, because I think, Alison, where you left off, might be an interesting place for us to talk about that. Anyone? Otherwise, you're going to hear me talk, and I'm no expert.
Okay, I'll just say two things. Because I do want to get to the roundtables as well. I think you need to have the policy in order to apply it. And so where I'm finding some gaps in an educational setting is the lack of policy. So when I used to work at the school board as a staffer, I had lots of policies to look through, can I accept gifts from students? What do I need to make sure a student can get a ride home if their parent doesn't pick them up, or a program went late or something like that? Those don't exist anymore, and there's a reason for that. And I think so. When I think about this question, it's a big one, because it also signifies to children and youth, well, what can you guarantee me when I'm in your care all day? And that really worries me, because it makes it difficult for me to respond to questions and concerns that do come up. Having said that too, I mean, there's sort of the explicit stuff around racism that takes place and then the other ways in which it impacts other policies and procedures. And what I mean by that is, for example, like a food program doesn't seem like it has anything to do with anti-racism, but I see a lot of nods, thank you. I'm just speaking to a room that already gets it, but it doesn't translate easily in the practical decision-making context at the school board. That when you're talking about, for example, cutting, minimizing, privatizing, you're talking about reducing living wage, you're talking about subcontracting to private workers instead of school board unionized workers. You're talking about kids who rely on food at school as maybe their only hot meal during the day, and there's a reason for that, and it's a systemic racism reason. And so I think that once you start to unpack sort of the application of the policy or the absence of the policy, it actually helps you do all the jobs a lot better. And consequently, that helps kids show up to school more frequently, increases attendance, and that's good for everybody. So teachers aren't chasing like, where did that kid go? You know, I haven't seen them in 3 weeks. It's like, well, you canceled the food program. So there's a significant draw that's missing. So yeah, it's just a couple ways to cut it.
Thank you.
I think one quick thing I want to add is that policies are very important in our work when we're doing anti-racism work and so on. But one of the challenges I see with the policy is that our policies are almost there is a problem of accessibility. For the very people the policy concerns, they can't read it, they can't understand it, because the language it is written. I really hope that we can start moving towards designing policy in plain English, that people can read and understand what is a policy is and why it is there. Another thing I want to add to policy is the leadership behind the policy, because if you design a policy and it is designed in a way that the people who design that policy don't have anything to do with that issue, okay, they can go around and interview people and collect the data, but I think the depth of the policy will always be missing. So readability, accessibility of the policy, but most importantly, that people writing that policy need also to include. I don't say that it should be just one group, but I think it should be a diversity of groups to write that policy, because the experiences, when you translate it into policy, help the readability. If not, it will be just an academic jargon. And believe me, I deal with that 24 hours.
Thank you. And I see Laura's already pulled the mic up to her, please.
Yeah, all this talk of policy just, got my blood going. We were talking about baby steps before and then the giant leap, and it made me think about the journey that we've been on at Diversity, trying to move from settlement to community building and equity, like moving away from that one-dimensional aspect. And our baby steps were looking at policies, but particularly tools and resources and questionnaires that we were using to do our work, and really recognizing that they weren't, because they were so based on traditional settlement assessments, needs assessments, and settlement plans, that they weren't strength-based, they weren't empowering, and they weren't meeting, they weren't centered around migrants and their experience. And so, like, we started, the baby steps were to start evaluating those tools, the policies, the procedures attached to what we call service delivery. And then we realized, wow, this needs to be more than just our approach to how the work that we do. We need to look inside at diversity, so the acknowledgement of, yes, we're extremely diverse. We have a set of staff members, 200 odd folks who are from all around the world, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we're equitable. And so we committed to doing a justice, equity, and diversity inclusion audit, and moving through that work, and hopefully leading by example, so this just becomes common best practice among settlement organisations. So that was the big leap to become essentially we can competently say an anti-racist organisation from the inside out, because we recognise that if we were trying to do the work outside in the community, we need to make sure that we're doing it inside first. And it's been hard work to do, particularly when you're under-resourced, you know, the whirlwind of being in a not-for-profit, but it's necessary.
Thank you for sharing that. I think it also speaks to this idea of, you know, creating systemic change actually happens at very sort of like, very individual levels, at very sort of like micro-institutional levels, right? If you want a large sort of broader systemic change in our societies, then they have to happen in the more sort of like immediate spheres of our own personal influence, right? Our own spheres of influence, our own networks. So that's great to hear that. I don't know if there's, we can maybe take one last point on this question. If somebody would like to share, if not, I can just share the last question and we can move on to the roundtable discussions. Yeah, please.
Well, I do think policy and law is so effective, but that's my bias as a lawyer. But I think often what's missing from that, and what's missing from much of our kind of political will conversations these days, is there's a lot of good words and not necessarily a lot of good actions. And that's true even on the legislative front. So even where we see that some human rights oriented or anti-racist actions have been legislated, they haven't been legislated in such a way that either has an enforcement mechanism or has a properly funded, effective enforcement mechanism. And so I think those are the pieces that I'm really looking to right now, is how do we move from words to actions, and in particular, how do we enforce the words that we're using. In the human rights context, that's very much that we need an adequately resourced human rights system to be able to deal with the individual complaints. I'm not talking about here the Human Rights Commission, but the Human Rights Tribunal is woefully underfunded to do the work that they do. I would say it's the same on the federal stage. But it's also just across the board. We've got a new DRIPA, the UNDRIP Act, and that's a really important step around combating anti-Indigenous racism, but if it doesn't have teeth, if it doesn't have an enforcement mechanism, we have to question its value. And I think that runs across the board with all the action plans, federally and provincially, that we really need to be looking at. Where are the teeth?
Right.
Thank you.
Great answer. So we'll move on now. I just want to share the last question. As I said, we won't have time to discuss it, but the pedagogue in me also understands that, you know, people learn a little bit differently, so I thought I'd just share sort of a visual that I use in my own work, which I think really does capture fundamentally, I think, sort of my understanding of the roots of the issue. So it's this picture that I love looking at sometimes and sort of talking with my students about, right? This idea of how fear creates ignorance and how ignorance eventually gets distilled into hate. And of course we know that racism is a product of hate. And so the question I was going to ask, which I will still ask, but which we won't unfortunately have the time to really discuss, is how do we actually eliminate the flame of fear? How do we at the very minimum diminish it? Is it a generational thing? Is it just a question of, you know, having to wait a few generations for that fear to sort of lower a little bit? If we talk about ignorance, then what are the ways in which we can actually alleviate that ignorance? How does education then become a process through which ignorance becomes mitigated through a system of knowledge? And fundamentally then, hate, what is the ultimate, I don't want to use the word weapon because that is in itself, I think, a hateful word, but what are the tools, what are the solutions that can actually help us remove this idea of hate? How do we combat hate in our daily lives? And then for people who are gathered in this audience, what are the roles that we as a public, not just as institutions or individuals working in these institutions, but as a public, how do we work on all these levels? I'll leave this image up for you to look at. I'll switch it off in a few minutes.
I have just one question about this image.
Yeah.
Because I throw it to my student and it was a riot in the classroom.
Yes.
Some of the BIPOC students in my classroom argued that the fear is not for other people. It is us who's supposed to be fearing. It's not the other way around.
So we fear ourselves?
No, we are the one who are always scared.
Yes.
You know?
Yeah.
Scared on the traffic, scared in the plane, scared everywhere because of what you are. I give you an example. I'm a Muslim. My name is a Muslim name. And I get stripped every airport I go through in the world. So I don't see my white friends being scared of anything like that. I am the one who is scared to be attacked. I'm the one to be scared to be targeted by racism. So telling me that the racists ignore me, it is why they are scared of me? No, me I say that racism is an outcome. They get something out of it. There is a sense of entitlement that I can do it and I can get away with it.
Right.
So the fear, I agree. Maybe the racists can be fearing me, which is quite weird because I have a beautiful skin. But let's also add that me as the racialized person, 99% of the time I'm the one who is scared.
Sure. That makes
So the
sense.
fear is me, not them. Yeah.
That's fair enough. Absolutely. Yeah, I guess the fear that we have as racialized individuals, you know, and you've laid some good examples. I mean, there is sort of a fear that we face as people who, you know, who are racialized. We certainly go through a process of that fear. Then I guess the question still remains that, well, what is ultimately been the cause of that racism to begin with? You know, we talked about structural racism again, but where does that all come from? Where does that idea of he's inferior to me and I'm superior to him, where does that come from? And certainly I think this is maybe not the answer, not the only answer, but something that I was thinking about, and thank you for sharing a perspective on that. So we'll move on from this picture. Let's get into our roundtable discussions. And what I'd like to do is I actually would like to invite the panelists to join a table and to engage in a conversation with the people who are here to talk a little bit about what is happening in the public, to hear from our audience in terms of what they're seeing and what optimism that they have for their future. We'll need to condense, I think right now we are sitting on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 tables. We'll need to condense ourselves down to 5 tables. And you're welcome, you're under no obligation. I understand your time is also precious. If you're willing to